Hello, welcome to the third installment of World War I. This will be about the stalemate and further developments. I have Icehouse Edge with this. Don't worry, third beer of the day out of 4. Anyway, but it is 8% alcohol, so things could go awry. So if you see me talking about World War I and the Germans, you'll understand that it's a beer-related issue. Talked about the background of the war. Actually, I had a video series preparatory to this called, what was it, Nationalistic Chain Reactions in Europe, 1815 to 1914. And that took, what, 4 videos to make. So complicated. Then we started with the outbreak of the war, you know, the causes, then the outbreak, and how it deteriorated very quickly for Germany. And it's interesting, you know, and I was that way too. We do learn more, and so you don't stay that way with things. Unfortunately, this beer will warm, so it won't be too flavorful at the end. I mean, it'll be flavorful, but not in the right way. I have the phone here in case someone calls. I'll tell them I'm doing a World War I video. A lot of people say Germany would have won World War I or World War II if they would have done these little series of things. But frankly, in reality, they were not. That country was not doing particularly well after the early stages of either war. And in my whole working premise is that they should have never gotten into the war, either time, the World War Part 1 or the World War Part 2. Which I think is a better way to talk about it. Because first of all, war doesn't usually solve your problems. It makes many more. Secondly, in Germany's case, they were in such a bad position that their chances of success were minimal. And their chances of disaster were quite good, a good chance for a failure. Well, we know that they had their Ostmark West II, that they instituted the outbreak of hostilities in August 1914, which was to hold off the great Russian attack, which the Germans believed would be slower than it actually turned out to be. And then they could rush through Belgium and Luxembourg, but, you know, Luxembourg's so small, but Belgium into northern France with 5 armies, hit Paris, and cause France to drop out of the war before, as they figured, things would swing out away from them, out of their advantage towards the advantage of the British. So it had to be an early thing because a long drawn-out conflict was not going to help them. Okay. Well, the Russian armies, 2 Russian armies, entered Germany very quickly in the early stages of the war, which threw off these plans. The Germans did go blasting through Belgium and France, and they did get 14 miles from Paris, and that's where they were stopped at the Battle of the Marne. The Battle of the Marne, pushed back towards the Belgian border, and then a stalemate ensued, and a trench line was established from northwestern Belgium, you know, along the Atlantic coast, all the way down, then into northern France and along the French-German border to Switzerland. Switzerland, a country who wisely stayed neutral in the First and Second World War, and in fact, every war since 1815. They had to get involved in the Napoleonic Wars because they got invaded. Okay, so did the trench lines move at all between 14 and 18? They did a little bit, not a significant amount. So what you had were the Allied forces and the forces of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. But of course, on the Western Front, it was Germany and a few Austrians, and that was about it. A few Austro-Hungarian, Habsburg forces. And they bled each other to death. So it was a war of attrition. It was terrible. And that's going to bring us into the strategy and tactics. Well, of course, the strategy of Great Britain was to put this suffocating blockade on the Central Powers and squeeze them dry. It worked. The British, French, and later Italian navies squeezed the Central Powers and slowly caused them to run out of any amount of war material and food. Even they were even blockading food items, which enraged Germany because they violated the accepted principles of war. But Great Britain always had a habit of not following the accepted principles of war if it was to their advantage, but always pointing out when the enemy would violate these principles. But so that was effective. The Germans were not able to break that blockade. The tactics used in this war were so throwback. And this, you know, we talk about the war against the South in 1861 to 1865, the USA attacking the South to try to keep those 13 states from breaking away. And they had so many casualties in that war, not just due to tactics, but also with very poor medical care. And even in World War I, the medical care was not too good. Just 100 years ago, it was very poor relative to today. One day they'll look back at our medical care and laugh and say, imagine how bad medical care was in 2016. But they're fighting these. You have to understand that the weaponry developed by 1860 was so powerful and had such a range and had such a rapid fire that trying to fight these wars in a Napoleonic way was guaranteed to cause you to have an extremely high casualty rate. So all through that war in America in the 1860s, and then other wars up to World War I and including World War I, they're using this, you know, they're trying to use the old strategy and tactics of maneuver. You know, the war of maneuver, outflank the enemy, then the cavalry comes in, and you have the artillery, and that's the way they were trained. And we can laugh at them today and say, look how stupid they were with these frontal assaults. Yes, it's true, but that's the way they were doing it. And so all through Virginia, you know, and in Georgia and Tennessee, you had these soldiers making these grand, and in Pennsylvania, these grand frontal assaults, which resulted in horrendous casualty counts. You say, well, they would have learned. Well, they didn't really learn, because in all through France, now on the Eastern Front, it's a little different because it's such a wide area that you're not going to have these you know, constricted trench lines. It'd be more of a war of movement out there. And I'm talking about in Poland and, you know, Galicia and all of that. But you still have these kind of ideas that they're going to use these cavalry charges and all of that. As the war ground on, they started to realize this was not going to work, or that things had to change. And that's when the Germans started to develop their stormtrooper ideas, which were implemented pretty successfully in 1918. We don't want to go too deep into that, but that was this idea that you don't try to hit the strongest point. If there's something bottling you up, you surround it, you neutralize it at least, and you keep going. You keep going. That's the key. You got to keep going behind the lines, because what happened 1914, 15, 16, and 17, really, they would have these massive artillery barrages and these great attacks, and they'd burst through the, with terrible casualties on the offensive side. They'd burst through the trench lines, but by the time they got a few miles into the interior of the enemy had retreated and reconsolidated and reformed lines, and you say, oh, well, we captured 12 square miles worth of territory. Yeah, but you lost 12,000 soldiers killed and 60,000 injured and wounded. You didn't accomplish much. It's a Pyrrhic victory. So now the problem with Germany instituting the stormtrooper tactics, is that by the time this was done, with the great offensives of 1918, Germany was very worn out, and they didn't have a whole lot of ability, men, resources, and money left, and willpower left to take a lot longer to get these victories. And plus, the American troops were arriving at a rate of thousands and thousands a day. So it was too late. Now, but these ideas will be studied and learned and used in this World War Part II, 1939 to 1945. But of course, trench warfare was not going to be so common in that war with the advent of effective air power. See, in World War I, we had airplanes. You know that. Airplanes first used in the Italian-Turkish War of 1911, 1912. But there wasn't really effective air power. It was effective for reconnaissance and some little minor air-to-ground attacks and some air raids that didn't in any way change the outcome of the war. But of course, by 1939, that's going to be a different story, and you're going to have very effective air power that's going to make trench warfare. And then you're going to have, of course, motorized vehicles, which are able to go long distances very quickly. So, okay, technology is going to catch up and surpass, and people will have to adapt. Now, how did the Allies and the Central Powers try to break this Western stalemate, Western Front stalemate? Okay, the Germans introduced poison gas in 1915. Killed a lot of people. The Allies counterattacked with poison gas, killed a lot of people. Then they had the masks were invented and other clothing to neutralize that. So in the end, the chemical warfare killed a lot of men, didn't break the stalemate. And then after the war, the countries decided that chemical warfare was so terrible that they would never use it again in a war. They have had instances of that being used, mostly in Arab countries against the Arabs or against the Persians in the 1980s, the Iraqi-Iran war. Countries kept and still keep stockpiles of chemical weapons in case someone cheats. But even during World War II, none of the Axis or the Allies used chemical weapons against each other, even though they had great stockpiles. But so that didn't change it. The machine gun killed a lot of people, didn't change the outcome of the war. It was a pretty new weapon for that war. I mean, I know about the Gatling gun and all that. The airplanes didn't change it. The Unterseeboot, the submarine, didn't break the blockade. Sunk a lot of ships. It was innovation. Wasn't the first war it was used in, but it was the first war it was used in to a large extent. The tank developed by Great Britain, and they call it the tank because they didn't want people to know what they were working on, so they call it a water tank project to fool the German intelligence service, which it did. But the tanks were so new, and their maintenance was so poor. You know, they would break down. I mean, they were high maintenance vehicles. They were very slow, terrible mechanical problems. They didn't even know how to use the vehicles correctly, so they did not succeed in breaking the stalemate. Now in World War II, oh well, that's a different story. You've got very fast tanks with better armaments being improved during the war, and a lot more reliable performance, especially with the Russian T-34 tank. Okay, so all these new weapons, and they didn't break the stalemate. Okay, so let's look at what's happening. Germany is stuck. And it's so reminiscent, even though it happened before, but you know, we're thinking back on all of it, last 100 years of what happened in World War II. Germany does not get the victory in the early stages. So now they're stuck. They are trying to figure out what to do. They can't protect their colonial territories in Africa, East Asia, and the Pacific, so they're going to lose all of that. I mean, there's no way they can protect it. The British and the other allies, especially Japan, are going to pounce on that, and they're going to lose it, and they're never getting it back, ever. Okay. See what I mean? If they had stayed out of the war, they'd have had these great African territories and all of that. Well, all right, but too bad for them. They got into it. Now there's this British blockade, British, French, Italian blockade, Russian, but the Russian Navy wasn't a great player. It's squeezing Germany dry. Now, yes, the British violated neutrality. Yes, the British violated the neutrality of the United States and the northern neutral nations, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. I didn't mention Iceland because Iceland was a colony of Denmark until 1918 when it became a self-governing part of the Kingdom of Denmark. They complained about it, and Germany was trying to say, look, you could join us, and we could all team up and fight the British and not be treated so badly. But the northern neutral nations didn't think that maybe was such a good idea, because obviously they thought Germany was going to lose, and so they said, well, we don't like being treated badly, but we're going to see what's going to happen. We'll hold back, see what happens. And so they suffered, their trade suffered, but they wisely just stayed out of it, just like Spain stayed out of it. Portugal was foolish enough to start cooperating with the British and helping the British, and the Germans got so irritated that in 1916 they declared war on Portugal. Portugal was no kind of great power. They had a small navy and a small army, so they weren't going to make a big difference in the war either way. Although both sides are trying to get all the allies they can get. Romania joined the Allies in 1916 and it was immediately invaded and surrendered after about a year. Bulgaria joined in 1915 to get back territory that they felt they had been cheated out of in the Balkan War of 1913. And if Bulgaria would have been smart, they would have stayed neutral, and they could have walked in and taken over what they wanted after 1918, at the end of the war, but they didn't realize that. They let the Germans talk them into joining the war, and it's silly because Bulgaria was a natural and historic ally of Russia. But some of these countries let themselves get talked into it, just like the Turks. The Turks had nothing to gain from the war and everything to lose, so they let Germany talk them into joining, and so they lost everything except for their main land of Asia Minor and a little bit of Europe. So Germany tried all these different things, these great attacks at Verdun, which lasted almost a whole year, and it just that was such a disaster for Germany. It was a disaster for France too, because France by 1917 was possibly on the verge of a revolution, with the socialist parties telling all the soldiers, you're fighting a rich man's war and it's a poor man's fight, and you're dying for the banking powers, and we should have a people's revolution, and then you could be free. Ha ha ha, yeah, free to be under a red slavery. But of course they don't tell them all of that. They're not going to tell them, we're going to take this bad situation and make it much worse for you. So that was the problem there. And the Germans tried during the Battle of Jutland, as the British say, or Jutland, as the Germans and Danish would say, up there at the close to Denmark in the North Sea. The German Grand Fleet goes out to fight the British, and it's the last great, really the last great ship-to-ship naval battle. And the Germans said, we won the battle because technically, on paper, we sunk more British ships than they sunk. That's nice. But the British said, yeah, you didn't win anything because we're still blockading you, and you sunk some more ships than we sunk, and we don't really care because you're still blockaded and you're still not getting any supplies. So it was not a victory for Germany. It was a defeat, because the whole purpose of the Battle of Jutland was to break the blockade, and it failed. And the British and the German Navy never came out again to fight the British Navy because they knew they would become, they would be mauled. Oh, they did fine in the Battle of Jutland. They were they made an admirable performance. Something to be proud of for Germanic naval history, but it didn't succeed. And here's the big problem. Now, of course, in the East, Russia was caught up in all kind of terrible internal problems like they had been for 400 years. Just the problem's getting worse. But especially with the socialist parties, Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, trying to overthrow Russia and set up a communist government. That's a real problem. That they almost succeeded in 1905. Came very close to setting up an atheist, red flag, socialist communist government in Russia. But the Russians were able to, the Orthodox Christian forces were able to counterattack quite ruthlessly, I might add, because they realized that when the Reds took over, it was going to be a reign of terror, much like when the Reds took over France in 1793. And you've heard about the pogroms across Russia in 1905, 1906. So there was this long-standing beef, let's call it, between the Russian Orthodox forces faction, the traditional Russians, and the revolutionary faction, many of whom fled Russia and went to New York City and Miami, if you follow what I'm talking about. Now, but not all left. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin left because he was going to be killed, like his brother was killed for plotting to murder the Tsar. But the Germans had this crackpot idea, like, we're going to sneak Lenin back into Russia, because they could see Russia was collapsing, right? They had all these problems, all these like terrible problems. And if they could cause Russia to collapse with an internal revolution, then they could blast them with everything they had, get them to drop out of the war, and then go take care of France and Great Britain before the United States jumped in, because the Germans knew, certainly, just like the anti-war Americans knew, the Americans that wanted to stay out of the war, that the Woodrow Wilson administration was plotting, or at least in conjunction with the New York Times newspaper, at least very favorable towards the British, and would not mind jumping into the war to help the British, because the Wilson administration and the New York banking and a media establishment was very Anglophile. Okay, so they wanted to spin the events and the news of the day in a way that would make the Americans think that Germany was the great evil and Great Britain was this stalwart for freedom across the world, and would trumpet every German atrocity and never mention ever the British atrocities, and get people stirred up. It wasn't really working so well, though. I mean, it was working, but there was still a great sentiment in America for staying out of the war. But the Germans were worried because they thought, this guy Wilson, he's going to plot and get us involved in this war. I mean, get America involved. And when they join, we're in big trouble. Like, we can't win now. How are we going to win if the Americans join, right? They had contempt for America. All they want to do is eat hot dogs and play baseball. But sometimes that contempt and that bravado is an attempt to mask your fear. So I think they definitely had fear. They knew America. I mean, these are not stupid people, right? Even William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, resigned his office in 1915 and publicly accused Woodrow Wilson of plotting to get the United States in war with Great Britain. Okay. and he's a liberal Democrat. I am not a fan of William Jennings Bryan. I'm a conservative Democrat. He's a liberal Democrat, so we would have been at loggerheads in opposition towards each other as far as politics. But as far as warfare, you have to admire him because he was anti-war. So he said, this president here is plotting to get us in war with Great Britain. Of course, he was right. Now, so the Germans knew this is a real pickle. I mean, we are in a real bad situation, like real bad, like the worst situation in history for Germany, basically. So they made these very risky decisions. We're going to sneak Lenin, because we're in this stalemate. August 1914, the whole catastrophe, the catastrophic event begins. 1915, a year later, the British can't beat the Germans, and the Germans can't beat the British. I mean, the French and the British, but we know that Great Britain is the straw that stirs the drink. And all these events for the last, well, since 1689, really. But anyway, murmur, murmur, murmur. But anyway, if you want to be techno. So we got a real problem. So they're going to take these risks. Okay. They sneak Lenin over there. There's already a revolution breaking out with the moderate socialists like Kerensky, who died in 1970, by the way, 46 years ago. The Tsar has resigned. He's abdicated because he just doesn't know what to do. And he thinks this whole thing is out of control. I have to resign. I'll be killed. My whole family will be killed. Well, that's exactly what happened. So Lenin goes in there, this little rascal, this murderer, this mass murderer, right? He goes over there and he starts his revolution in late 1917. He's not like a Bernard Sanders type communist, right? Like a guy that's going to talk peace and love while plotting death and destruction. No, Comrade Lenin is going to talk death and destruction while plotting death and destruction. Okay. I mean, he's like a hardcore, like real killer communist. Him and his gang would, of course, his supporters, Stalin and Trotsky, right? And all of them. Okay. So they go in there and they begin to overthrow the Russian Empire. And by 1918, they've murdered the Tsar and his whole family. And we know about those events at Yekaterinburg. You see, Lenin was a coward, of course. He would kill all kinds of women and children. He was scared, because he realized that if the white army, when we use the term white, we mean anti-communists. This goes back to 1793. And when we use red army, this is meaning pro-communist. This goes back to 1793. The French Revolution, the white forces were the Bourbons with the white flag, and the red forces were the French Commune, the Ancient Orient Masonic Lodge, Maximilien Robespierre with the red flag. Okay, so please put that in context. But he realized that, the Tsar, as weak as he was in a lot of ways, and timid and kind-hearted and all that, if the white forces did succeed in rescuing the Tsar Nicholas II Romanov and his family, that, hey, Lenin and his little red gang is going to have a real problem. Like, they're going to die. Rightfully so. But so he ordered the communist forces, troops, a hit squad to go in there and murder the Tsar, his wife, and all the children. Now, after that murder, we can only say that every Communist Party member worldwide at that point and since then would be guilty of capital treason and would be subject to immediate reprisal of any sort. But, you know, that's off the subject, but that would be the standing warrant, more or less, worldwide. But anyway, so they launched this bloodbath in Russia, and Russia cannot obviously fight Germany anymore, and Russia is forced, well, you know, it's comical. Lenin, the cynic Lenin says, well, let's sign a peace treaty with Germany, then we can consolidate our red victory in Russia, and then we can counterattack Germany and take back everything we gave up and more. So it's a pretty clever plan, got to give him credit. And it worked. It worked pretty well until Russia got surprised on during June of 1941. But anyway, so here's the plan. We're wrapping this up as far as that. The United States was obviously going to get involved in the war because the British were going to spin it. And I'm not pro-German in this. I mean, I'm neutral. I don't care. But just talking about what happened. You know, there's going to be some incident at sea, and that would give the president the opportunity to go to Congress and say, we have to fight this great German empire. You know, and if you read the New York Times articles, they're talking about Germany could take over the world, just like in 1940, 41. Germany could take over the world. Now, a sensible person would say, now how would they take over the world? They can't even go 30 miles across the English Channel. You know, the Strait of Calais, Strait of Dover. You know, they can't get ships 30 miles across this strait to go to Great Britain, but they're going to take over the world. Imagine that. You can't go 30 miles for years, but you're going to take over the world. Man, that's interesting. How would you pull that off? Wow. 1916, you can't beat Great Britain and France together, or Russia together, but you're going to take over the world. Now, you know, the anti-war Americans were pointing these facts out. They were saying, how do you suppose Germany was going to do that? The German Navy is going to sail across the Atlantic, and they're going to land in Virginia and take over America. If you can believe these sorts of things, you can believe almost anything, right? Well, let's get back to the story. But it's comical because this is the things newspapers were actually telling people, and people were believing these things like, I'm so scared. Germany might take over Kentucky. That's right. They're going to take over Kentucky. They can't take, you know, but they can't take over Paris. Okay. All right. Woodrow Wilson had to run for office to get reelected, right? 1916, he had to run for reelection. Now, if he gets reelected, this is war guaranteed. Germany knows this. If Wilson gets reelected, he is going to do something. He's going to do whatever he's got to do, and America's coming into the war. Now, Germany knows this, so they're watching this election really close. The only problem is the Republican candidate, Charles Evans Hughes, you know, sort of a Mitt Romney type guy. He stands for whatever would promote his political career, right? That's his, like, you know, what is in your heart? Or whatever promotes my political career. So when Hughes would be in like St. Louis, Missouri, he would say, we got to stay out of the war, you know. If he's in New York City, we got to help those allies. So he's one of these wishy-washy, Wendell Willkie type, Dewey, Gerald Ford, you know, the kind candidates, and he loses the election. It's a close election because you've got two candidates running against each other that are basically the same candidate. The only thing the Democrats and the Republicans differed on at that time was that the Republicans wanted a high tariff for protectionism, and the Republicans wanted a high tariff, and the Democrats wanted low tariffs. This is a fight that had been going on since Jefferson and Hamilton, in fact. But the Republicans today have given up on high tariffs, and they're along with they basically become the Democrats part 2. A lot of people don't realize that, but that's another video. Okay. Wilson gets reelected. Close election, but he gets reelected. Okay, so he's reelected. He's in. Now Germany realizes that's it. That's it. America is going to join the war. So we have the Zimmerman Note. British intelligence intercept, because of course they're spying on everybody. Back in those days, the British intelligence agencies spied on everybody. Wait a minute, what do I mean back then? Excuse me. The British intelligence agencies spy on everybody. I was saying it in past tense as though it had stopped. Excuse me. And they intercepted this German telegram from their foreign minister to their ambassador. Their foreign minister Zimmerman to their ambassador in Mexico City. I know we're going over 30 minutes. I'm trying to hurry. And it was saying, okay, you need to talk to the Mexicans who are in an almost war with the United States in 1917. Since the United States, Woodrow Wilson, the great aggravator, if you want to call him, decided he was going to insert himself into the Mexican internal conflict of 1910 to present. You know, Woodrow Wilson is this great moral guy. He's like Jimmy Carter of 1914. He's going to tell other countries what they need to do. And Woodrow Wilson was willing to use force to do it. He was willing to kill you to help you. That's why the United States began bombing Mexico from the Gulf of Mexico in 1914. Okay. And then U.S. troops invaded Mexico. So they're in a quasi state of war anyway. So Germany was saying, look, if you join us in this war, at the end of the war, when we win, you could have Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California back. You can have all those territories back. Now the Mexicans say, okay, we would like to have those territories back, of course. We don't like America. We hate America. They don't hate us anymore. Or do they? Okay, well, I can't remember. Anyway. Oh, just kidding. All right, anyway, so obviously the Mexicans liked the goal, getting back those territories, but they didn't like the idea of joining an ally who was already losing, and they knew the result would be that if they did join Germany in this project, that the United States would immediately invade Mexico and they'd lose even more territory because Germany's over there in Europe. They have no way to help Mexico. So the Mexicans was saying, we're going to look at this, oh, it's very interesting. Oh, yeah, it's very interesting, man. We might really want to do it, But they're thinking to themselves, we're not joining those crazy Germans, man. They're going to make us lose more territory, And then the Germans were talking to Japan and saying, all right, okay, you took our islands. No big deal, because we do those kind of things too. We always use opportunities to grab people's stuff. No problem, not a big deal. But they're telling Japan at the same time now, late 1916, early 1917, the Germans are telling Japan, wouldn't you like to have all those American and British island territories out there in the Pacific? And of course, the Japanese are thinking, actually, we would. Now, Japan was thinking, we really could get away with this. Mexico's thinking, we can't. We're going to get killed. We're going to get massacred, which actually would have happened. But the Japanese are thinking, yeah, this could work out. Right? I'm talking about 1916 and 1917. They're thinking this could work out. They kept thinking that. But anyway, the British intercepted the telegrams and they gave it, of course, to the New York Times newspaper, who's pro-British. So they immediately published it. And then Wilson is going to say, oh, look. Of course, they're giving him what he wants. Look what the Germans are planning to do, you know. They've made war on us. And Theodore Roosevelt, the former president, who was always hot to join a war and who was always pro-British, I might add, was saying, yeah, we have to fight. We have to fight the Germans because they're such a danger. You know, they've disrespected us and all of that stuff. So naturally, the Germans figured, hell, we might lose, but I mean, we're German. If we got to go all out, then it's going to be Brunhilde and Valkyries and a berserker rage, and we're going to take down as many people as we have to take down. This is the way it's going to go down. It's not going to go down like, oh, well, you know, we lost. So, you know, you have this German fanaticism that starts to kick in this ring of the Nibelungen. And so they say, that's it. It's, you know, everybody's coming down with us. It's the Gotterdammerung. And they announce unrestricted submarine warfare has now resumed in early 1917. And that's the German attitude. If we got to go down, everybody's coming down. We're going to blow it all up. You know, kind of like in Escape from the Planet of the Apes. We pushing that thing down. We blowing up the whole world. We don't care. I mean, that's just the way they think. All right. Or I'm sorry, the way they thought or think or might think one day. All right. Anyway, so of course, in April 1917, the Congress declares war on Germany because, you know, we don't want to get taken over by Germany. We don't want German troops marching through St. Genevieve, Missouri, and Texarkana. You know, like that's going to happen. So and then there's going to be a draft, and all the American soldiers can go die to make the world safe for all these things that the media tells them they're dying for. What was it? What did they say? Oh yeah, democracy. You're going to go die for democracy. And oh yeah, and to make the world safe for democracy and to end all wars. Good thing we ended all wars, huh? Or what do they say you're going to die for? There's always something you can go die for, become mentally ill and come back mentally disturbed, and or your face blown off or crippled. There's always, we know that there's always a good reason to serve in these madcap projects. Oh, I'm sorry for letting all this anti-war rhetoric seep into this World War I discussion. But so that's the situation. Germany could not break the stalemate. The British didn't need to break the stalemate. All they needed to do was get the United States in the war. So to wrap it up, time was on the side of Great Britain's in a way, because the longer the war dragged on, the better the chance of the U.S. jumping in would be. Okay. In the case of Germany, time was most certainly not on their side, because every month that went by, their chance of winning became less and less. And by 1917, their chance of winning this war was almost non-existent. Almost, I said almost non-existent, but practically non-existent. So on part 4, we'll talk about the final stages of the war, and you know how that ended, with Germany and their allies losing a terrible defeat, which once again, I said, that's the whole lesson of this. Don't get into the war. And, you know, war is not healthy for children and other living things, or healthy for national economies either, by the way. And there might be a part 5, the repercussions of the war, but we all, I say that, we all know, we should all know the repercussions of the World War Part 1. Formerly known as World War I, but really the World War Part 1, 1914 to 1918/19, if you want to look at it correctly. The World War Part 2, 1939 to 1945. and the World War Part 3, 1944 to present, the present day. Thank you for watching this video production.